Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Tonight I want to welcome Frank Joseph. He was the editor-in-chief of Ancient American magazine from 1993 to 2007 and is the author of several books, including Before Atlantis, Advanced Civilizations of Prehistoric America, The Lost Civilization of Lemuria, The Lost Treasure of King Juba, and the book we will be discussing tonight, Military Encounters with Extraterrestrials, The Real War of the Worlds. Frank, welcome. How are you doing tonight?
Thank you so much for inviting me, Chris. I'm doing fine. I hope everybody on your end is healthy and well as well.
Yes, we're doing as best as we can, amongst the madness that we're experiencing. I've been looking forward to speaking with you tonight. Your book is an amazing comprehensive history of military and armed confrontations between humans and possibly extraterrestrials. And this was your first book about the UFO phenomenon, right?
Yes, that's correct. I was very reluctant to write on such a subject. Matter of fact, I was even cautioned, maybe warned, not to, because it would affect the rest of my other books that deal with archaeology mostly. This was so far afield, some of my critics thought that it was not a good idea, but I decided to because of something that happened in 2018, and that was when the United States Navy finally made a very important disclosure about contacts between several of their pilots, more than several, dozens of their pilots and their ground personnel and ship personnel with what can only be described as vehicles not of this earth. And that encouraged me to go ahead and publish some of the terrific material I've been collecting for the previous 30 years.
Now, based on the research you did for your book, what would you say is some of the earliest military encounters that you could come up with?
Well, I think we know exactly what the earliest documented military encounter was, and that goes back more than 3,000 years ago, nearly 3,500 years ago. And I'm glad you asked me to talk about this in the beginning, because this was the thing that changed my mind on the entire UFO thing. Before 1991, I believe that it's possible that there's life elsewhere, but I was very critical of UFO sightings and so forth. It was really not part of what I was really interested in at that time. 1991, I was visiting the Cairo Museum Library. I was doing some archaeological work on a particular pharaoh by the name of Thutmose III. And it had nothing to do with anything except his place in the ancient history of Egypt. And at this library, which is the greatest library in the world for original source materials, I was able to access all of these, as anybody does. And they have translations in about a dozen different languages. And they brought up something, the librarian brought up something to me about Pharaoh Thutmose that I'd never heard of before. It's called the Tulli Papyrus, T-U-L-L-I. It's named after an Italian archaeologist who came into possession of this very important document that relates to the reign of Thutmose III. And I was shocked when I read this. I read the translation first in English, and I thought perhaps there may have been some mistake. I can also read German, so I read the German translation, and it was exactly the same. And what the story says, it's not a complete account. Some parts of it are missing, but the majority of it is there. So we know just exactly what this Tulli Papyrus says. It says, I can quote part of it for you.
Sure, yes.
It says, quote, the 6th hour of the day, which would equate to 1 o'clock in the afternoon, on an unspecified day in February, sometime in February, in the year 1457 BC. It says, quote, during the 22nd year of Thutmose's reign. And that's how we can establish that that is the date, 1457 BC. And the document goes on to say that multiple persons, this could be as much as a huge crowd, a disc or a ring of fire, now that is the way it's translated, a disc or ring of fire, quote, coming in the sky. Its body was one rod, that's about 150 feet long, and one rod wide. It had no voice. In other words, it was silent, as numerous, probably the majority of UFO sightings, even when they're close up, these vehicles are noiseless. It goes on to say that when the crowds of people in Egypt saw it, quote, their hearts became confused. Then they laid themselves on their bellies. Some went to the king to report it. So this object flew almost the entire length, it would appear, of the Nile Valley. There was no interaction between people at all. And this object. It cruised at a low altitude. We don't know how high, but it was low enough for the naked eye to perceive that it was a disk of fire, and it slowly vanished towards the north. Now, the next day, this object returned, only it was joined by an unspecified number of other rings of fire or disks of fire. And it was seen by what must have been many thousands of people. And the Thule Papyrus goes on to say, the army of the king looked on, and his majesty was in the midst of it. In other words, he was out there. Thereupon they, the fire disks, went up higher, directed toward the south, and vanished. What had happened, the Thule Papyrus explains that these reports kept coming into the king, Thutmose III, and like any political leader, he had to do something to show that he was in charge still, so he sent out the army. Now, there wasn't anything that an army, Bronze Age army, could do against flying vehicles, but nonetheless, he had a show of force. That's all he could do, probably mostly to maintain civil order. It was witnessed by the king himself, by his whole household, government, people. These objects then rose at a pretty good altitude, appears, and just flew away. Now, this is the interesting thing I found particularly interesting about this report. It's a bureaucratic report. It's not a religious treatise. It's not anything about mythology. It's not a story. The Thule Papyrus deals with nothing but political and chronological records. It's a bureaucrat's report. And the bureaucrat, who we don't know, the guy who wrote this, he writes at the end, he says, quote, a marvel that never occurred since the foundation of this land. And it was ordered that this event would be recorded for His Majesty in the annals of the House of Life to be remembered forever. Now, if you look at the rest of the Thule Papyrus, the scribe, the bureaucrat, never makes a personal statement like that. So he was mightily impressed. Now, this is the first documented confrontation, if you want to call it that, or observation by the military, the Egyptian army, which at that time was the superpower of the world. Under Thutmose III, Egypt was the foremost military, economic, and cultural phenomena on Earth. And we have an official document from the government at that time that explains this. Now, when the Thule Papyrus first came out, well, actually, before it came out, Thule himself, the Italian archaeologist, was so shocked by this account that he never disclosed it during his lifetime. It was in his private papers, and after he died, right after World War II, his family his family members were going through his personal papers, and they turned this over to the Egyptian Museum, and the Egyptian Museum translated it and published it. When it first came out, this was around 1950, it was finally released. Critics around the world refused to believe it. There must be some mistake. And so Russian, German, and American archaeologists tore the Thule Papyrus apart to make sure that it was authentic. They had 3 separate translations. and the three translations are virtually identical. Since then, we've heard nothing about the Thule papyrus. It's not discussed at all. And yet there it is in the Egyptian Museum, and all the background information which I researched on it is correct. So we have a document that shows that this phenomena of UFOs goes back a very long time, probably much earlier, but this is the earliest documented account of its kind. That really changed my life because I began collecting materials afterwards for decades after, from 1991 all the way up until 2017, when I decided to finally publish them because of the U.S. Navy's disclosure. And in writing that book, I found writing the book was incredibly fascinating, correlating all this material, and also frightening, because these confrontations have accelerated into our time. And it's like there's a silent war that's been going on for literally hundreds of years. Deaths have occurred on both sides. The destruction of vehicles on both sides has occurred. And it's a kind of a different story and a not altogether pleasant one.
Yes, indeed. And it goes very deep and in many different directions. The majority of your book was focused on some of the more modern occurrences, mainly starting around and before World War One. What was one of the first more modern military encounters that you write about?
Well, the first solid one, I discussed several in that chapter on World War One. Let me just back up a little bit to qualify that. So far as my research has been able to determine, I did not find a single incident in which there was any violence between, let's assume that these are alien visitors that are coming to our world. There have, of course, been thousands of sightings over the last few thousands of years. But during all that time, I could find no incidents in where there was a death or injury on our side, or any meddling to the point where there was destruction. I couldn't find that. That changed radically in World War One. That is like a line in the sand between the past, in which there were sightings, to be sure, not much for interaction, credible interaction that I could find, but definitely World War One changed. And that's an interesting thing. Why would that happen? Why would this relationship that seemed to be benign for so many thousands of years suddenly change in World War One? For two reasons. At the beginning of World War One, for the very first time, human beings could put high explosives aboard a heavier than air craft to use it to bomb others. If these extraterrestrials are, as we speculate, in possession of knowledge of other worlds, and perhaps have a higher culture than our own, as they would appear to have, certainly technologically, it would not take much of a deduction to see that if you could have even a primitive bomber like the British, that's the first bomber was a British aircraft, carried about maybe 75 pounds worth of bombs, not even 100 worth of pounds of bombs, but it's not difficult to extend that into the future. And it wouldn't be too long before, from the beginning of this primitive bombing aircraft, less than 30 years later, the Germans were launching V-2 missiles into the stratosphere. That's a huge technological leap. And yet that took place within only 30 years. And I think that I speculate that the aliens saw that we had finally mastered not only high explosives, but the ability to go beyond the surface of the Earth. That was something that got them interested. The other thing was the creation of really high explosives, and that was in the United States. Probably our listeners are familiar with the DuPonts. The DuPonts won all kinds of international prizes for creating nitroglycerin. And the DuPonts were the major munitions suppliers of the Western Allies, France and Britain and Russia, from 1914 to 1917. And it is at that time, in 1916, that some very peculiar activities began to take place, which are quite well documented. I got most of the documentation from the British, and I have, this is not speculation, this is not baseless. Anybody that can read about this in my book, I refer them to my source materials, and they can check them out themselves. What happened in 1916 is that a number of the DuPont munitions plants throughout the country, but primarily on the East Coast, began blowing up. They were destroyed. Now you think, well, that's not quite so unusual. It's a long time ago. Places like that blew up all the time, right? Because they don't have the same kind of security we have today. That's wrong. Historically, the DuPonts had a superb security and safety record. The DuPonts are, of course, also the big suppliers of munitions to both sides of the Civil War, both the Union and the Confederates. Union won primarily because they had greater access to what the DuPonts had. But from the Civil War, 1865, all the way to 1916, there were no serious accidents at any of the DuPont plants, the munitions plants. But in 1916, there was a series of huge detonations that diminished the supplies of munitions that the United States, the DuPonts, were supplying to England and France. Well, so what? In each one of these explosions that took place, that decimated these munitions factories, each one, strange, unusual aircraft were seen. Now, this is 1916. This is only like about 10 or 12 years after the Wright brothers first flew, and aircraft, especially in the United States, were rarities, hardly seen at all. And the aircraft that were seen and reported in the newspapers are often described as Mexican hats. They looked like Mexican hats. And in other words, they were flat, they were like disc-shaped at the bottom, and they had like a dome on the top. And the coverage that was given to this is remarkable because it was not only in the newspapers, but also the security briefings of the United States Army. And at that time, there were no aircraft to speak of. Probably maybe a dozen aircraft in all of North America at that time. So that's when you see, I go into, of course, far greater detail than I can here, the limitations being on the air. I spent a whole chapter on these munitions factories that were being blown up, would appear, by these extraterrestrial craft. At the same time that this was going on, or right at the very end of it, I should say, this period of destruction went on all through 1916 and pretty well stopped by 1917. But in March 1917, there is an extremely well-documented confrontation, the very first confrontation of its kind between the United States Navy and an extraterrestrial intruder. This was on the East Coast. It was at the Portsmouth Naval Yard, in which 3 Navy guardsmen opened fire on an object that was approaching them out of the night, was totally quiet, was bright green light and metallic. They didn't shoot it down, but it zoomed away after they fired on it. This is the very first hard documentation for that, because these 3 men were court-martialed. They were not believed for this confrontation that took place, but during their court-martial, other Navy officers had heard about this incident, and they came and testified that they had seen the exact same vehicle, flying craft, at other parts of the Portsmouth Naval Yard, and they were not prosecuted after that. But the judgment of the court-martial was that they had no idea what this vehicle was. Perhaps it was a German spy's aircraft. Well, that's preposterous, of course, because aircraft in those days, they had no manifolds. They were incredibly loud. They certainly did not fly. You couldn't fly at nighttime. There was no nighttime experience in those days. And so the idea of a German spy plane was preposterous, but they just speculated that. That's the first, and that is really, those are like the opening shots in what has been an ongoing silent war that continues to this day. And I believe that the documentation is strong. When I started to write this book, I was concerned that I stay away from speculation as much as possible. And so every incident in the book that is described is documented. I have a backup for it. Sometimes the backup is better than others, I admit that. Sometimes it's just from newspapers. or from other UFO groups, but I tried to get the UFO groups that are as responsible as possible, like MUFON, for example. Their reports are extremely credible. But I also have a great deal of government documentation that backs them up. Just as an aside, if anyone doubts that some of these things are authentic, I would recommend that they just go on to the United States Navy website. It's huge, it's gigantic. The U.S. Navy has posted a lot of, almost all their records that are declassified are on this website. And I found a lot of shocking things. I don't think that the Navy even realized some of the material that they have put out there. Some of the confrontations between UFOs and the Navy in the South Pacific during World War II were astounding and almost comical, actually. And yet there it is. It's all spelled out by the Navy themselves. So I got some pretty good sources when it comes to that.
Now, when it comes to some of the UFO encounters and stories and phenomenon from the World War II era, we've heard so many, not only unverifiable theories and stories, but some that are so fantastic and amazing, it's hard to imagine that they could be true. What are your thoughts on, were the Nazis and Hitler reverse engineering craft, let alone the Vril Society channeling beings to get the information to engineer these crafts? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I was very interested in that aspect of it. I researched it as thoroughly and honestly as I possibly could. And I found that I don't write about this particularly in the book because it really didn't fit in. The book is called, of course, Military Encounters with Extraterrestrials. But I can tell you something that I didn't put in the book. I considered doing it, but it really didn't quite fit, but maybe it fits in with our conversation here. There was a highly verified incident that took place in early 1936 when a large oval-shaped, kind of like almost between an oval and a cigar, silvery-shaped craft crashed outside of Milan, Italy. And the fascist authorities were alerted to it immediately, and under the specific orders of Benito Mussolini, they arrested everybody in the area that saw this thing. What I mean by that's actually too strong a word. They were detained because the Italians and Mussolini himself believed that this craft that had crashed outside of Milan in 1936 was a secret weapon being tested by the British to spy on Italy. There was never any thought that this was from outer space. And so this object was warehoused in northern Italy. The people that were detained were very shortly allowed to leave later on. And there was not much secrecy imposed upon this thing. It was written up in several Italian newspapers. We don't know what this possibly is. But Mussolini was convinced that it had something to do with the British Royal Air Force. And so he had his top scientists examine this thing to back engineer it so that the Italian Air Force could have what the British had. And the scientists came back to Mussolini and said, we have no idea what this is. They didn't say it's from another world or anything like that. I said, this is definitely not British. It's not European. We have no idea what this is. We just do not know what it is. It took them quite a while to disassemble, and I guess they tried to reassemble part of it. In 1937, when Hitler visited Mussolini in a state visit, Mussolini told him about this object and said, we can't figure it out. Why don't you take it and have your scientists look at it? Maybe you can do it. Mussolini kind of changed his mind afterwards. He says, okay, your scientists can look at it, but it can't leave Italy. Okay. So Hitler sent some of the scientists down there, and the Germans had a completely different point of view on this thing. They looked at it and they said, we don't know what it is, but we're going to make it work anyway. And so the Germans worked on this all through the 1930s into the early 1940s, a very limited way. And they decided the only way this thing could be back engineered was to strap jets to it somehow. So they tried to put some jets on it, and they were not very successful with it. And so that is as far as the documentation goes But the Germans devoted some real serious efforts to try to figure out what this thing was. They did not succeed. And the stories about them manning these superior Foo Fighters and all that, that seems to be unfounded. Things get bent out of shape and extended over time. There was one of the German scientists. The German and the Italian scientists worked very closely together on this. One of the scientists went to Canada right after World War II, and he worked for the Avro Company. And as soon as he showed up, the Avro Company said, "We know you're working on this flying saucer. We want you to make one for us too." And he said, "Well, we didn't get very far." But nonetheless, Avro had him do something called the Avro car. And you can look this up on YouTube, and it is a flying saucer, and it's designed by this same German scientist who was looking at these things. And it didn't perform very well. It was very unstable. So it has not been, they were not successfully back engineered. And stories about the Germans in Antarctica and all this, it's groundless. It's stories, it's very dramatic, it's interesting. The Germans never had anything like that at all. That is pretty much the extent. It's not as exciting as, getting involved in a shootout or putting iron crosses on this thing and flying against B-17s. This never happened.
Now,
Oh, go ahead, yes.
No, go ahead and finish if you had.
Well, I just wanted to finish up by saying this is not to say that the Germans did not have more encounters with extraterrestrials. They definitely did. But then again, all the air forces of World War II, all of them had what was the Americans called Foo Fighters. These either luminous spheres or discs, which sometimes attacked their planes. The Germans had this too. There was a very famous event that I talk about where there was a female woman test pilot for the Luftwaffe. Her name is Hanna Reich, and she flew the first rocket-propelled aircraft. And during this was the Messerschmitt Me-163, and during a 1943 test of the Messerschmitt, the plane could exceed, could do like, 4 miles in 30 seconds or some incredible speed like that. She's flying this aircraft almost vertically when she reported that a glowing sphere-like object, a little bit bigger than her own aircraft, pulled up alongside and then shot past her. And this was not a woman that was given to fantasy. She was one of the greatest test pilots of all time. The Germans had other sightings, just as the Americans, the British, and the Japanese did. The Japanese had a bad confrontation at the very end of World War II in 1945 in Busan, which is in Korea. Some UFOs were sighted by the Japanese. They sent up some interceptor aircraft, and they lost one of their planes. They also did some damage. Apparently, they had 20-millimeter cannons on their aircraft, and they did apparently do some damage to these 2 UFOs that were skirting along. And one of the UFOs managed to down one of the Japanese planes. So it's one of the few occasions where there was a death involved. There were some. The Americans, the worst actually probably were the Americans. They had and this is beautifully, not beautifully, but it's accurately recorded. It was a B-17 bomber in 1943, late 1943, over France, that was set on fire by these things, and all men aboard it were killed. That's part of the U.S. Army Air Corps records. So there were some violent confrontations. Not many, but there were some, and there were deaths involved, to be sure.
And you mentioned a few minutes ago when we're talking about the Nazis and Antarctica, I wanted to talk a bit about Admiral Byrd. You write a little bit about his mission to Antarctica. For those who may not be familiar, I'm pretty sure most of my audience is. Tell us a little bit about Admiral Byrd and some of the things that happened on that mission.
Well, there is a German connection to it, kind of indirectly. The Germans in 1939 had launched a purely scientific expedition, not a military expedition at all, as is sometimes described. It's totally untrue. The Germans were looking for sources of more whale oil because the Norwegians had a kind of a monopoly on that. They were charging high prices for oil. So the Germans sent down a ship, a scientific ship, to Antarctica. It's called the Schwabenland. And they were down there it was part of a propaganda thing to claimed territory, or not really claimed territory, just claimed that they were there. And this is in 1939, and Admiral Byrd was a friend of the German Antarctic Society, and he was invited to go down with them. Admiral Richard E. Byrd, for those of our listeners unfamiliar with him, is the greatest Arctic and Antarctic explorer, among the greatest of the 20th century or any time. Very highly respected international figure. And the Germans invited him to go down. He said, "I'd love to go." He says, "but our two countries have very bad relations right now," so he couldn't go. But he knew these people, the Germans that were down there investigating. And when the Germans went down in 1939, they saw something. And they saw something they did not expect. And the documentation on this runs really cold. It's hard to, it's just, the documentation on this German expedition is very excellent. There's plenty on it, but it just ends abruptly. And the trail suggests more than it actually talks about. There's no doubt that they saw something that terminated their stay down there by many months. They just, whatever they saw, they came back. I believe what they saw was a UFO nest. And all the implications seem to point to that there were several that they stumbled upon, and they photographed it, and they shared that information with Admiral Byrd after World War II. Admiral Byrd then contacted his friend, James Forrestal, the Secretary of Defense, that they were buddies, and said, "We have to go down there and wipe them out," is basically what he said, that they're too dangerous. And America at that time had just won World War II. We were the supreme military power in the world. We thought we could do it. And so they launched Operation High Jump, an extremely expensive, huge military invasion. Imagine that, invading Antarctica, but that's what it was. It was not a scientific expedition. You don't send submarines, destroyers, aircraft carriers, flak vessels, communications vessel, a whole task force. It was known as Task Force 68. It was gigantic. And at a time, this is 1946, after World War II, disarmament is going on like crazy. The United States is destroying its weapons, taking them down. There's no need. There's no more enemies in the world because they're all dead. Even most of our allies are dead. So there was this huge rush for disarmament. And right in the middle of that, the United States brings up all this last of its huge military armor at sea. It was a military invasion, and Admiral Byrd said it was. He got in trouble for that, as a matter of fact. He was asked by a reporter, "Well, Admiral Byrd, what is the purpose of this expedition you're launching? Is it purely scientific?" "No," he said, "it's a military operation." And he was hauled away, and they had some yes man trying to explain, "Oh, Admiral Byrd just misspoke." Okay. So they go down, they invade this Queen Maud's land in Antarctica, in the Bay of Whales, right where the Germans had been, by the way, because that's where they had been directed to go. And they ran afoul of a force that was totally superior to anything they knew. The Task Force 68 was taken apart. Men were killed. Ships were sunk. Admiral Byrd lost half of his flying boat fleet was destroyed. They were supposed to go down there for 8 months. They left after less than 3. When the ships came back, they were in such bad shape that they couldn't even go back to Norfolk, Virginia, where they came from. They limped into Valparaiso, Chile for repairs. They were that bad off. And when it was kind of an ironic scene, because the band was playing Anchors Away, the Chilean band, and everybody's out there with Chilean and American flags, waving them in. And when the people saw, the Chileans saw what terrible shape these listing burned up vessels looked like, the crowd went hush, the music stopped. And then when the ships arrived, stretchers of the badly burned men, and some of them already dead, were carried off. A plane then came down to pick up Admiral Byrd, and they flew him straight back to Washington, D.C. And he was taken on the carpet because just before he left Chile, he gave an interview with one of the world's great newspapers called El Mercurio. This is the largest Spanish-speaking newspaper in the world. It still exists, one of the oldest continuous newspapers in the world. And Admiral Byrd was asked, what happened to your ships? What happened to your men down there? What happened? And Admiral Byrd talked in an evasive way, but one of the things he said, he says, I don't want to alarm anyone, but we have to be concerned about craft that can fly from pole to pole in a matter of moments, and that we have to be ready for some very serious military possibilities. Well, when Byrd was flown back to Washington, D.C., those revelations were too much for the Secretary of Defense, Forrestal. Forrestal said, we're going to sack you, we're going to retire you, at least temporarily, and you're not to talk to the press or anyone. Your career for now is over. And they did everything they could to jump on that release that came out. The story of Task Force 68, Operation High Jump, has never really been covered thoroughly in any book. What I've tried to do is cover it as thoroughly as I can without trying to speculate, but trying to rely on the facts as much as possible and my sources. And there's no doubt from those sources that an attempted invasion, a military invasion, was undertaken by the United States Navy. I can get on public radio and say this. The United States undertook a military invasion in 1946, late 1946, of Antarctica, specifically for the purpose of wiping out a UFO nest. It failed in 1947. It had losses in men and material. Ships were sunk, planes were downed, and that was the end of Operation High Jump.
And to your knowledge, we didn't seek any type of retaliation against that basic ass whooping that we received?
You bet we did. You have to consider it. This was right after World War II, and we were the toughest, the meanest, the best, and we really, especially the military, was really filled with terrific confidence. And this place turns out to be overconfidence. And we did. Admiral Byrd had been working with Forrestal. It was really Forrestal who came up with this idea. I hesitate to even talk about it because it's kind of complex, but I will try to summarize as best I can. Now, everybody's heard about Roswell, which took place, of course, in July that same year. Operation High Jump returned prematurely to the Americas, first Chile and then back to Norfolk, in February and in March and early April 1947. Very shortly thereafter, something happened called the Roswell Incident. And the Roswell Incident was nothing more than payback. We were going to get them for having humiliated our forces. And the way it was done was simple. From 1945 all the way through to the early 40s, and I assume even to the present day, atomic energy plants, especially military atomic energy plants, were buzzed by and reconnoitered by these objects more than any other place. That's the thing that really stuck into Admiral Byrd's craw, was because he was completely unable to counter this spying, which he regarded as spying of our atomic energy facilities. The very first atomic energy facility we ever had was in Hanford, Washington. And the moment that place began to produce plutonium, this is even before World War II ended, this is in February 1945, the very moment they began producing plutonium for the bombs that were going to be dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that's when these objects began to show up. And Secretary of Defense Forrestal had an interceptor squadron established at Hanford. Those planes could never catch up to these objects, but they kept coming back. And so Forrestal decided what we're going to do is we're going to advertise that we've got some, for the aliens, we're going to advertise that we have a big atomic assembly going on. We're going to weaponize our B-29s. This is 1947. They're all going to be announced as they're going to be carrying atomic bombs. That ought to attract these little bastards. And by that time, by the way, by this time, 1946, 1947, they knew that these craft were not run by Germans, that they were run by somebody from some other place. And so that's what they did. Very few people have realized that Roswell, at the same time, 1947, of the Roswell Incident, was the center for the largest and actually the first atomic bomber squadron in the world. That's because Forrestal did that on purpose. He knew he couldn't shoot these things down with conventional weapons. That was impossible. They were not vulnerable to our artillery. Our aircraft could not reach them, as was proved at Antarctica during Operation High Jump. But what he did is he set up a radar array, low-frequency radar array that was right over Roswell Field. In other words, he had like about four different low-frequency radars, and he set up their beams as a kind of a cat's cradle, an invisible cat's cradle, so that when these objects showed up, and sure enough they showed up, they flew right into that invisible cat's cradle they didn't see. The equivalent of flying through this field that was set up, this low frequency field, would be like flying into a microwave oven. And that's exactly what happened to their craft. These two saucers that intercepted Roswell Field in early July 1947, their interiors became, in effect, microwave ovens. Even earlier than that, I think as early as late 1946, these radars were used by Air Force personnel to shoot down ducks. They could actually cook ducks in midair. They were able to fry in the air so many ducks that they would take them into a local diner, and they would say, "Can you dress these ducks up?" And everybody had lots of ducks. So this was well known. This was not anything new that Forrestal had invented. And this is not speculation, because the bodies that were taken out of these vehicles and the autopsy reports are available. They are authentic. They're not faked up. The autopsy reports and the man in charge of the autopsy, whose name escapes me at the moment, it's in the book, all describe these little corpses that they found as being cooked. They all had brown skin, so they've been subjected to some high temperature, some sudden high temperature. So that's what happened. Roswell was come back for Operation High Jump. That was still not the end of it, because we could not put an end to the little buggers in Antarctica. And the story gets so incredibly bizarre. Hardly anybody knows this either, but there was an operation that was undertaken to, get this, an operation between the United States and the Soviet Union. This is at the height of the Cold War, listeners. This is in the mid-1950s, and in the early 1960s, we were supposedly at each other's throats. The United States Air Force and the Soviet Air Force teamed up, guess what, to drop not one, but two highly radioactive atomic air blasts over Antarctica. Not even only Antarctica, which is a huge continent, but over Queen Maud Land, the same area where all this had taken place, Operation High Jump, and the Germans.
Oh, wow, yeah.
So this has been going on, it's extremely hush-hush, but the paper trail, some of it, a lot of it, is there, but you have to dig it out, and that's my job. My background is in journalism. I'm not a UFO specialist. That was another reason why I hesitated to write this book. I'm not a ufologist. I know far less than these other people that are investigating this all this time. What I've done, I just took these reports and I threw out most of them because they weren't good enough. They weren't convincing enough. And I kept only the credible ones. And the credible ones themselves are incredible. It's so bizarre. But it's happening. There have been this war that I talk about, this silent war, is really a number of skirmishes that have gone on from World War I all the way to the present day. And why the aliens could wipe us out at any moment. What they could do, if they really wanted to wipe us out, wouldn't be by attacking us like in the movie War of the Worlds, which is a pretty cool thing, but it's rather clunky. The way they would wipe us out And I'm not saying that it's being done now, but the way they would wipe us out is by just simply dropping a pathogen from another world. And that's the way you get rid of human beings. But they haven't done that. Or maybe they haven't, unless this COVID-19 is something, who knows? But I don't think that's what it is. So why I don't have answers to any of this, by the way. I have only questions still. I wrote this whole book. I'm not an expert. I don't know anything about it at all. All I know is what the documents show. And the documents show that before World War I, we got along with the aliens pretty good. They'd show up, they'd be seen, they might even abduct people from time to time, who knows? But there was no military confrontations. But from 1916 on to this time, there have been. And there have been some, and I've talked about this in the book, there have been some hellacious battles between UFOs and the Soviets. Bad stuff. A lot of men killed.
Very interesting. Now, moving a little bit forward in history, you mentioned encounters during the Cold War. Talk about any encounters you might have researched in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, during the Korean War, Vietnam, any profound encounters that you could tell us about?
It's a good point you bring up, because during the interwar periods, there seems to be very little or next to no confrontations. I found really only one you could call a military confrontation between 1918 and 1939. There was a flight of British fighters that had all of a sudden they just lost power and they were about to crash when they regained power. So that's a possible confrontation. But these confrontations usually take place when our wars are going on. And during the Korean War, there were dozens or hundreds of incidents. I couldn't even recall. You could write a whole book on the military confrontations with extraterrestrials between 1950 and 1953. But there's one that really is outstanding. It's outstanding not only because it's so strange, but because the documentation is impeccable. The man who gave this information was an eyewitness. There's no doubt on his back, checking on him, that he is the real thing. And this involved a sighting in which there were a number of U.S. infantrymen stationed along a mountain ridge. Very common situation back there this was in 1952, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. It's described in the book. And they're just waiting for the enemy to show up, the same old thing. When they see this large object sort of crawling over the hill, just low over the hill, and they have no idea what it is. But of course, like military men everywhere, if they don't know what it is, it's got to be the enemy, right? I mean, they're not thinking, oh, look at that craft from outer space. Nobody ever gave any thought to it. And just as an aside on this, because it fits in, I don't like to digress too much, but it's interesting. A huge number of these reports, these military reports, whether they're Soviet or American or German, it makes no difference. When these things are first seen, these saucers or craft, they're almost immediately regarded as the enemy. They never think, oh, that's from some other planet or some other dimension. When the Germans saw these things, oh, that's American technology. The Americans see it, oh, that's German technology. And the same thing in the Korean War. So these American GIs are on this ridge, and they see this bright green, incredibly green object coming down, and they don't know what it's sort of coming towards them, but it doesn't seem threatening. So they open fire on it. Well, naturally, you're in a military situation. Well, whatever this thing was, it didn't take very kindly to that, because it was able to burn some men very badly. Some men were badly burned, and the men panicked. And they had an underground bunker, and they all jammed themselves into this bunker. And after this incident, a number of them were found to be very ill. None of them died, luckily. And they suffered burns and so forth. And this was a straightforward account by this corporal and his comrades, and he even had some of his own colleagues back this up, that this object it was rather large. It was about 20 feet in diameter, kind of like a glowing beach ball out of metal. And it retaliated and hurt these men. They were all hospitalized. They were all decommissioned after that. I think that's one I think that stands out from the Korean War.
What about any from the Vietnam era that stand out for you?
Lots from the Vietnam era.
Yeah, maybe just a couple of really, good examples.
One that I thought was particularly interesting was that from the United States Marines, they were to occupy a village as a common practice. And they came to this village, and there was no one in it at all. The village was completely deserted, and I thought, well, that's not so strange in itself either. And they marched up a hill not too far away, and there were all the villagers, and they were all dead. So they assumed that they had been massacred by the Viet Cong. It turns out that they had all been burned to death. And so while the Marines are trying to figure out, well, they've never seen anything quite like this before, the Viet Cong attacked them. And so the Marines withdrew because they were very badly outnumbered. They withdrew to a mountainside. And while this is one of the few times it would appear that the aliens ever took sides. So the Marines are withdrawing, and the Viet Cong are attacking up the mountainside. A large sphere appeared, very large sphere appeared, and all of the Viet Cong were killed. They were all killed, burned identically the same as the villagers had been burned. And this incident took place within just moments. The men's weapons were twisted and virtually melted. So the Marines were, that's one of the few instances where the Marines were actually saved, it would appear, by the intervention of this extraterrestrial vehicle. The most outstanding single event, which was witnessed by hundreds, maybe thousands of men, it's possible, was the Hobart event. That was, I believe, in 1969 or 68. The Hobart was an Australian destroyer in the Gulf of Tonkin. It's on patrol, and its radar picked up a number of these unidentifiable flying objects coming from Vietnam, but they were flying at an incredible speed, and the maneuvers were just impossible. And the Hobart was fired upon by these objects. They tried to return. The Australians tried to return fire, could not, because these objects were traveling at such incredible speed. You could not track them. Some aircraft were lost. And then that incident, the commanding officer, not the Australian commanding officer, he said nothing, but the U.S. Navy commanding officer in that area described these objects as completely unearthly, had no contact with anything with Vietnam. It certainly were not ours, and they were very aggressive and had damaged the ship and had also downed a number of aircraft. There's a lot of there were a lot of men on these patrol boats that saw things. They would go deep into the Vietnamese jungle. The thing that I think that distinguished Vietnam more than any other previous conflict involving UFOs was the mutilization that went on. There were several incidents in which Americans were badly mutilated, killed, and it was thought that the North Vietnamese had done this. Turns out that the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, had never been in these areas where these men had so badly mutilated. The worst incident of that was in a report called the Grudge Report. And I went through a lot of difficulty getting a copy of that. I got the complete copy of the Grudge Report. I had to go to Canada to get that thing. Now I've got copies in the United States. And the Grudge Report tells about a B-52 that went missing in Cambodia. And so some Green Beret type specialist, it was not the Green Beret, specialized unit, of course, committed international violation of law. They went into the Cambodian jungle and they found the B-52. And they said it was so bizarre because the B-52 was in almost pristine condition, was sitting in the middle of the jungle. There was no indication that this aircraft had landed. It couldn't land. the jungle was so thick, and here's this, it's not even in the clearing, here's this B-52 sitting in the middle of this Cambodian jungle. And so they went into the jungle and they found this thing and they investigated. They went into the aircraft and they found that all its bombs were on board still, its ammunition, everything. And the crew was there. The crew was all dead and they had all been badly mutilated, very badly mutilated. And so no one could figure out how that had been. But then there were a number of associated sightings of vehicles immediately before this vehicle disappeared. The Grudge report states also that this area was so remote that not even guerrillas or rebels knew about it. It was almost inaccessible. And here was this aircraft with its mutilated body. So Vietnam had a number of incidents like that in which Americans had been killed and badly mutilated.
What are your thoughts on the theories and reports that certain factions of our government possibly work with extraterrestrials? Example, President Eisenhower supposedly making a deal in exchange for technology with extraterrestrials. Give us your thoughts on that.
Well, I've always found that very interesting, but I could not verify President Eisenhower actually having some kind of a deal or something like that going on. There are some oral reports, verbal reports about that. So take that into consideration. It's possible. I couldn't find anything to establish it. However, there was a very disturbing report. A man by the name of Paul Schaefer. Some of your listeners might be familiar with that.
Yes.
And he was, of course, an engineer, and he had been hired by the military to help create this underground base that they were working out in Dulce in the American Southwest. And his report, his presentation, which anyone can see, it's on YouTube, I think is incredibly credible. And I did as much research as I could on him and what the things that he said and his background and so forth. Basically what the United States was doing at that time, or some element of the United States military. They had to actually come to some kind of a correspondence, an agreement with some aliens. That's correct. And they built this underground base specifically for back engineering some of the alien technology. The aliens had promised that they would share with them their advanced technology, but they never did. They never did. And the deal was this: as hard as this is to comprehend, the deal was that the aliens would share some of their technology with the military, but the military would have to supply the aliens with a certain number of human beings for their purposes. And apparently that was done. At Dulce, there was a bad confrontation between the aliens and the American military. There are two militaries were involved, the Army and the Marines. And there was a confrontation because there was a conference, a talk being given by one of the aliens. How that talk could be made, I have no idea. But the alien was somehow communicating to a small group of people, and one of the established procedures was, the criteria is that when there's a presentation like that going on, none of the human beings could bring any weapons. Could not have any. So this Marine walked in, and he forgot, and he left his sidearm on. The Marine was immediately killed by one of the aliens. A firefight engaged in which all of the aliens were killed that were at that base in Dulce. The Americans went on South Amal and killed them. Some American lives were lost, but it was mostly the aliens that were killed. And it was immediately after that that Dulce was shut down. Now that story, which is mind-blowing, unfortunately has a great deal of validity to it, because Mr. Schaefer, shortly after making this disclosure, was tortured to death, was himself tortured to death.
Right.
And they say he was committed suicide. The nature of his condition of his body precluded any possibility of suicide. Who did this to him, how this happened, who knows? But the very nature of his passing lends terrific credibility to what he shared with us. And if this was the only such incident, I would not have really pursued it, I don't think, except that the Soviets had also a similar situation in which the aliens had volunteered to share their technology with the Soviets, but they never did. They always spoke evasively and made promises, and meanwhile, the Soviets, like the Americans, would provide them with certain human beings for whatever purposes they needed them for.
Now,
So,
didn't Eisenhower threaten to basically raid a base in New Mexico to gain access to some information?
I've heard about that. I've not been able to verify it. I don't know that that actually happened. There is some indication that there was something like that going on after Eisenhower's time. A story which, again, I hesitate because it begs the imagination, was that Richard Nixon was a close friend of the entertainer Jackie Gleason. And Jackie Gleason, they were both golf buddies, and they were pretty close. And Jackie Gleason was taken by Richard Nixon to see some of these vehicles at a secret base, and to see some of the aliens that had been saved from that firefight and were put in pickle jars, as it were, formaldehyde. And that really changed Jackie Gleason's life. It really just, it drove him to the point of almost to madness. Didn't bother Richard Nixon at all, but it bothered Jackie Gleason quite a bit. And that story, which I had heard before, but I refused to put in the book, and it's not in the book because I don't have enough to really nail it down. But since the book came out, I have been able to meet some people that have verified that story for me. So it's possible, to answer your question, I'm sorry in such a roundabout way, that certainly the Republican administration at that time, which included, of course, Richard Nixon as Eisenhower's vice president, that there was some kind of knowledge going on. And I would not be at all surprised to hear that Eisenhower had been involved on some level. But certainly Nixon was. There's no doubt that Nixon was involved in this. The reason why we are not able to back engineer alien technology, we have possibly back engineered some, a little bit, but not most of it, is because their technology is not only totally unlike ours, it doesn't really bear any resemblance to anything we can understand. What I mean by that is the vast majority of UFOs, credible UFO crashes that have been examined, have found these vehicles to be virtually empty, hollow shells. They have seats in them. They may have a few, not even dials, just hardly anything. They're barren. They're like the inside of a shell. And that speculation is the reason why these things are able to operate. There's no visible means of propulsion. How is that possible? No visible means of propulsion. They don't make any noise. That's because it's conceivable that these craft are completely controlled by the mental powers of these beings. The beings are often shown as the grays with these enormous heads. Well, those enormous heads may contain the intellectual capacities to master things that we can't even dream of. Our own human brains, we only use what they say about 10% of our own intellectual capacities. Imagine a human being that could master 100% of his intellectual capacities, his potential, his mental potential as 100% would be godlike, beyond anything we can imagine. Well, perhaps these creatures have reached some levels of that, and that would explain why their vehicles are really just hollow shells. They're like rowboats. And their propulsion, in other words, they're able to bend time, is what it appears to be, comes entirely from their own mental capabilities. Many UFOs, many of them, even those are being filmed today, they seem to just phase in and fade out. They don't fly away. They don't fly into view all the time. Many times they will just appear and then disappear. And that's because they're folding time. They're creating vortices, as it were. Like, for example, if you stir the water, you can see a vortice begin to develop. Maybe they can do the same thing with space, and they can bend time. And that's possibly what they are. They're time travelers. They might be time. That's a possibility. But that helps to explain why their vehicles are so barren, because they are really controlled by their own mental capacities.
Now, to close out tonight, I'd like to get your thoughts on some of the things that are happening right now with disclosure, mainly the TTSA and some of the players involved there. Me, personally, I think the whole thing screams disinformation, but that could just be me. I'd like to get your thoughts on it.
Well, I can understand your skepticism, because the United States especially has had a very poor track record of disclosure. But there have been, over the years, even from the 1940s right through to this present time, there have been quite a large number of U.S. Air Force, Navy, and Marine officers, sometimes high-ranking officers, that have spoken out on behalf of this.
Yes.
Not officially. They can't do that officially. So I would like to think that the disclosures that began coming out in 1918 are authentic, that they do promise a greater disclosure in the future. The pilots, the Navy pilots that have been allowed to make their disclosures, I think, are certainly telling the truth. They call them the TikTok and so forth that they've tracked. So I would like to be on the positive side. I don't know. You might be right. I might be wrong about that. But it's got to the point now, especially because everybody has cell phones, they can take pictures everywhere. The documentation on UFOs is just huge now. It's never been this overflowing. I mean, these films or these images are being taken by average persons around the world. Ordinary people have nothing, no agendas of their own. They're not all involved in CGI. And a great number, maybe even the majority of these videos that are surfacing now are extremely impressive. So you can't keep a lid on it anymore. I think the technology being available, coming available to the average person now, and documenting these events is beyond the power of any government to control. You just can't control it. So I would like to think, I hope, that there is this period of disclosure going on. What concerns me is not the disclosure so much. What truly concerns me is the continued military aggressiveness of our species, something perhaps we can't control. And I think what has started this undeclared war is the concern of the extraterrestrials about us putting atomic weapons beyond our own planet. That when we are a threat to the galactic neighborhood, that's what concerns me. Not that they will land and want to share their technology or whatever with us. I think that if there's going to be a war in the future, we could very well become extinct because of it. And that's what bothers me.
Very well said. And Frank, thank you so much for coming on tonight. Fascinating information. And for those that would like to find out about more of your books, where can they go? Any website, social media, anything like that?
Well, they can't go to their bookstores anymore, so the best place to get Military Encounters with Extraterrestrials is still Amazon.com. And I would be hopeful that someday I can write a sequel to this, but right now I'm contented to discuss these things with you, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to Forbidden Knowledge News to talk about these things freely tonight.
Well, thank you again, Frank, and we will definitely be having you back on in the future to discuss some more.
Thank you much. We'll see you then.